Maplewood, a small town in rural America, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone by name. The houses lined up on quiet streets, the parks full of children on the weekends, and the coffee shop in the city center were the scenes of a seemingly perfect everyday life. However, within the walls of Maplewood Middle School, Lucas Harrison lived a very different reality. Lucas, age 12, was a boy with a fertile imagination but few words. While other boys his age ran around the soccer fields, Lucas preferred to sit under the shade of trees, with a notebook in hand, writing poems and stories that captured the world in a way no one else could see. His brown eyes sparkled when he lost himself in his creations, but at school this sparkle went unnoticed, overshadowed by the laughter and cruel comments of his classmates. Since Lucas started writing when he was still little, his parents encouraged him, buying him new notebooks and asking him about his stories. But at school, this passion was seen as a weakness. "Real boys play soccer, they don't write poetry," said the other boys, especially Brad, the leader of the group who constantly ridiculed him. Brad was everything Lucas wasn't: popular, athletic, and confident. And for some reason, that seemed to bother him deeply. Physical education classes were a nightmare for Lucas. He had no interest in sports, and his classmates made a point of mocking his lack of ability. During breaks, while the other students talked and laughed in groups, Lucas isolated himself with his notebook, trying to ignore the dismissive looks. But isolation only increased the provocations. One day, Brad took his notebook and read one of his poems out loud in front of everyone, distorting the words and turning something beautiful into a cruel. What Lucas didn't know was that his words had reached the school principal, Mr. Bennett. He was a middle-aged man, known for his firm but fair stance. He had a keen eye, able to notice what other adults often missed. Upon learning of what was happening to Lucas, Mr. Bennett decided it was time to act, but in a different way than one would expect from a school principal. Instead of punishing the attackers, he decided to value Lucas's talent, creating a space where Lucas's voice could be heard, and the principal organized a creative writing workshop, open to all students but with Lucas as the main participant. The proposal was simple: express your emotions and ideas through words. Mr. Bennett knew it wouldn't be easy for Lucas to put himself out there in this way, but he believed that by giving him a platform for his creativity, he could turn the pain of isolation into something powerful. News of the workshop spread around the school, and soon became a new source of laughter for some. "Let's see what the poet will come up with now," they said sarcastically. But what no one expected was that this workshop would become a turning point not only for Lucas, but for all students at Maplewood Middle School. As the first session approached, Lucas felt a mix of fear and hope. Sitting on his bed the night before, he leafed through his notebook, full of unfinished drafts and scribbled ideas. Would anyone understand his words? Would he finally find his place? The weight of these questions was almost unbearable. On the day of the first workshop, the sun seemed to shine differently, as if something important was about to happen. Lucas entered the workshop room with hesitant steps, holding his notebook like a shield. To his surprise, there were more students than he imagined, some curious, others simply present because of Mr. Bennett. In the center of the room, the director was waiting with an encouraging smile. "Welcome to our creative writing workshop," said Mr. Bennett, looking directly at Lucas. "Today we will explore the stories and emotions that lie within each of us. There is no right or wrong here, only the truth of our words." Lucas took a deep breath and opened his notebook, feeling the weight of all the expectations, both his own and those of others. He knew this was the moment to show who he really was, not with gestures or screams, but with the words that had always been trapped inside him, waiting to be released. The first few weeks of the creative writing workshop were more challenging than Lucas imagined. The room was made up of a diverse group of students, many of whom he didn't know well, and some of the more familiar faces worried him most. Brad and his friends had signed up, apparently out of pure curiosity, or perhaps in hopes of finding more reasons to mock Lucas. At first, Lucas could barely look up from his notebook. He felt exposed, as if every word he wrote could be twisted and used against him. Mr. Bennett, sensing the tension, began with simple exercises, encouraging students to write about everyday things, like their mornings or a favorite place. But instead of turning the activity into a competition or performance, The director emphasized the importance of writing from the heart, without fear of judgment. Brad, of course, didn't miss the opportunity to turn the exercises into a joke. His texts, always full of sarcasm, made his friends laugh, and he seemed pleased with the attention. But, contrary to what Brad expected, Mr. Bennett never reprimanded him. Instead, the director asked questions about the meaning behind Brad's words, encouraging him to look deeper into his own feelings, something Brad clearly avoided. Lucas observed all this in silence, dividing his time between listening to others' readings and scribbling ideas in his notebook. As much as he wanted to, he still hadn't shared any of his writings with the group. But then, one day, everything changed. Mr. Bennett announced that the next exercise would be different. Each student should write about a moment that deeply affected them, something they would keep to themselves. The reactions were diverse. Some students immediately started writing, while others hesitated, not knowing how or where to start. Lucas, however, felt his heart speed up. He knew exactly what he wanted to write about, but the fear of being humiliated again paralyzed him. After a few minutes of silence, Mr. Bennett broke the tension. "Writing is a form of healing," he said softly, "and sometimes the words we're most afraid to say are the ones we most need to share." These words resonated with Lucas. With hands shaking, he began to write. Each word seemed to weigh a ton, but he let them flow, registering his pain, his loneliness, and his desperate desire to be understood. When he finished, Lucas realized that he had written one of his most personal poems, something he never imagined showing to anyone. "Who would like to share?" asked Mr. Bennett, breaking the silence again. Nobody raised their hand. The room was filled with silent expectation until, surprisingly, Lucas raised his hand, almost against his will. All eyes turned to him, and Brad gave him a sarcastic smile, as if eagerly awaiting the next opportunity to ridicule him. But Lucas was not intimidated. He took a deep breath and with a trembling voice began to read. "In the silence of the trees I listen to my soul." A voice that whispers, but no one cares. "The words I write are all I am. But in the outside world, I'm just another node. The days pass slowly in the emptiness of being. My verses are echoes that no one wants to read. But here in this space between lines and pain, I find a piece of who I am, whoever I am." When Lucas finished, the room was completely silent. Even Brad seemed speechless. Mr. Bennett smiled, a smile of genuine pride, and asked, "Lucas, would you like to tell us more about what this poem means to you?" Lucas hesitated for a moment, but then he found the courage he didn't know he possessed. "This poem is about how I feel most of the time," he began, his voice still shaking but steady. "I've always been different from other kids, and it's made me feel alone. Writing is the only thing that makes me feel connected. But at the same time, I feel like no one really understands or cares." The silence in the room was broken by an unexpected voice. "I know what it's like," said Megan, a girl who always sat in the back of the room, almost invisible. "I also write, but I never showed it to anyone because I thought it wouldn't be good enough." Suddenly, other students started talking, sharing their own experiences and insecurities. What once seemed like a simple writing exercise was turning into something deeper and more meaningful. Even Brad, who always seemed unshakable, was quiet, lost in his own thoughts. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the workshop changed drastically. Brad stopped mocking Lucas, and although he still maintained his arrogant stance, something in his eyes had changed. He began to participate in the discussions, not with sarcasm, but with genuine curiosity. Lucas, in turn, felt increasingly confident in sharing his creations. Writing was no longer a solitary refuge, but a bridge to connecting with others. However, like every journey, Lucas's was about to face an unexpected twist. During one of the last sessions of the workshop, Mr. Bennett announced that there would be an open school-wide presentation where workshop students could read their work. The news was received with enthusiasm by some, but with anxiety by others, including Lucas. The idea of exposing his emotions in front of the entire school was terrifying, but Mr. Bennett believed this would be the climax needed for the students to truly face their fears and overcome their barriers. "Writing has power," he said, "but this power is only truly felt when it is shared." The night before the performance, Lucas could barely sleep. He reviewed his poems countless times, trying to decide which one to read. Finally, He chose the most recent one, the one that reflected his transformation throughout the workshop. He knew this would be his chance to show who he really was, not just to his peers, but to himself. On the day of the presentation, the school auditorium was packed. Parents, teachers, and students filled the seats, and the atmosphere was one of anticipation. When it was Lucas's turn to go on stage, he felt his heart almost come out of his mouth. But when he saw Mr. Bennett's encouraging look in the front row, he found the strength he needed. With the microphone in hand, Lucas took a deep breath and began reading. His voice, previously trembling, was now firm, full of emotion and truth. The words flowed like a river, and each verse seemed to touch a new chord in the hearts of those who heard it. When he finished, silence was followed by a wave of applause which enveloped him like a warm hug. But what Lucas didn't expect was what came next. Brad, the boy who had ridiculed him so many times, got up from his seat and walked to the stage. For a moment, everyone held their breath, expecting the worst. But Brad did something no one could have predicted. He reached out to Lucas and said with a sincerity he had never shown before, "Thank you for this. You made me realize something important." That was the night Lucas not only found his voice, but also earned the respect of his peers. And in that small town of Maplewood, something changed forever. The night of the performance changed everything for Lucas. He had never imagined that his poem could have such a huge impact on others. The next day, when he arrived at school, he felt different. The whispers and looks from his colleagues were no longer one of contempt, but of curiosity and respect. For the first time, he didn't feel invisible. The days that followed were like a dream. Lucas began to receive praise from colleagues who previously barely noticed him. Some even asked to read more of his poems. Mr. Bennett continued to encourage him, but also made a point of reminding Lucas to keep his feet on the ground. The true value of words is how they transform us, not just how they are received by others, he said, but deep down Lucas knew that not everything was resolved. Despite the others' change in attitude, something still bothered him. Brad, who had previously led the jeers, now seemed distant. Although he had thanked Lucas after the presentation, he had once again isolated himself, keeping quiet and avoiding others. That sudden transformation in Brad's behavior did not go unnoticed by Lucas, who felt that there was something more behind that change. One day, while Lucas was in the library, Brad suddenly appeared. Without his usual confident stance, he seemed nervous, as if he was fighting something inside himself. "Can I talk to you?" Brad asked hesitantly. Lucas nodded, surprised. They sat at a table in the back, away from any prying ears. Brad was silent for a few moments, looking at the floor. Lucas, not knowing what to expect, remained silent, waiting for Brad to speak up. "I don't know where to start," Brad finally said, his voice low and carrying a weight Lucas had never noticed in him. I'm not what everyone thinks I am." Lucas frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Brad took a deep breath as if he was preparing to jump off a cliff. "I've always been the popular guy, you know? The leader, the athlete. But actually, I feel lost most of the time. When I saw how people treated you, I knew it was wrong. But participating in it, it made me feel less lonely. And when you read that poem in the workshop, something in me changed. I realized I was being a horrible person, but I didn't know how to stop." Lucas felt a wave of empathy for Brad. He had never imagined that the boy who seemed to have everything could also feel so vulnerable. "We're all struggling with something, Brad," Lucas said softly. "I also often feel lost, but writing helps me find my way." Brad looked at Lucas, his eyes filled with an anguish he was trying to hide. "I'm not good with words like you, Lucas. I don't know how to express how I feel." Lucas was silent for a moment, reflecting. Maybe you don't have to be good with words. Maybe it's about finding a way to be honest with yourself, even if that means accepting that it's okay to not have all the answers. The two sat there for a few more minutes, neither really knowing how to continue the conversation, but both feeling like something had changed between them. Brad finally got up, thanked Lucas, and left the library, leaving Lucas feeling uneasy. He knew that Brad was still struggling with his own demons, but he also knew that the door to a possible friendship had been opened, however fragile it was. A few days later, an unexpected turn of events shook the school. Mr. Bennett, the mentor who had inspired Lucas and so many others, was suddenly hospitalized after suffering a heart attack. The news fell like a bomb, and the entire school was in shock. For Lucas, who saw the director as invaluable support, the news was devastating. He felt lost, as if the ground beneath his feet had disappeared. With Mr. Bennett out of action, the writing workshop was suspended and school returned to its normal pace. But something was different. The whispers that were once of admiration for Lucas were now of concern for the director's condition. The absence of Mr. Bennett seemed to have taken the shine off everything. It was then that Lucas made an unexpected decision. He knew he couldn't let all the work and inspiration Mr. Bennett had cultivated go in vain. Mustering up the courage he had, he decided to continue the creative writing workshop on his own. He gathered the students who were still interested and encouraged them to continue writing, even without Mr. Bennett present. Lucas knew that keeping the spirit of the workshop alive would be a way of honoring his mentor. What Lucas didn't expect was the impact this decision would have. With him at the helm, the workshop took on a more personal tone, with students opening up more than ever. Brad, to everyone's surprise, began attending sessions regularly, and although he was still not as vocal as others, his presence and attempts to be involved showed that he was really trying to change. The group grew, attracting other students who had never considered writing as a form of expression. The workshop became a safe space where emotions could be shared without fear of judgment. The change was palpable, and Lucas felt that, for the first time, he was making a difference not just for himself but for the entire school. But, like every journey, destiny had one more surprise in store. A month later, Lucas received news that shook him deeply. Mr. Bennett had succumbed to the complications of his heart attack and had passed away. The loss was a severe blow, and the school was plunged into mourning. Lucas, feeling more lost than ever, questioned whether he had the strength to continue. He knew that the workshop had been a reflection of Mr. Bennett's spirit, and now, without him, everything seemed meaningless. But it was Brad, the boy who once despised him, who pulled him back from the abyss. "Lucas, you need to keep going," Brad said one day as he approached Lucas in the hallway. "Mr. Bennett believed in you and he believed in the workshop. We need it now more than ever." Those words were what Lucas needed to hear. He realized that Mr. Bennett's legacy was not just in his physical presence, but in the lessons he had left for each of them. Determined to honor his mentor, Lucas announced that the writing workshop would continue, now as a tribute to Mr. Bennett. And that's what he did. At the first meeting after Mr. Bennett's funeral, Lucas read a poem in honor of the director. A poem that spoke about loss, but also about the continuity of life, and the lasting impact one person can have on the lives of others. When he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Brad was the first to applaud, followed by everyone else. From that day on, the workshop became a school tradition, a place where Mr. Bennett's words continued to live on through the students he inspired. Lucas, who started out as an isolated and insecure boy, found not only his voice, but also a purpose. He understood that his journey was just beginning, and that although the future was uncertain, he was prepared to face it, with Mr. Bennett's lessons as his guide. The months that followed were of intense transformation for Lucas and the entire school. The writing workshop, now named Bennett's Words, became a symbol of unity and resistance. Students who had never previously been interested in writing began to participate, drawn to the atmosphere of mutual support and sincere expression. The impact Mr. Bennett had left was undeniable, and Lucas felt more responsible than ever to keep that flame alive. The process of leading the workshop brought many challenges. Lucas, who had always been shy and insecure, now needed to deal with issues he never imagined facing. There were times when he doubted himself, questioning whether he was truly up to the task. But every time he felt discouraged, he remembered Mr. Bennett's words. "The true value of words is how they transform us." This motivated him to continue. The workshop also began to attract attention beyond the school walls. Teachers from other subjects, impressed by the positive impact on student morale, began to encourage participation. Even parents began to notice changes in their children, more confidence, empathy, and a renewed desire to express themselves. Little by little, Bennett's words stopped being just an extracurricular activity and became an integral part of the school's culture. But this new responsibility also brought new challenges. As the group grew, different opinions and conflicts emerged. Some students, accustomed to the calmer and more intimate dynamics of the workshop, began to feel uncomfortable with the increase in the number of participants. Others found it difficult to deal with the vulnerability required by the writing process. Lucas realized that, to maintain harmony, he would need to find a way to balance these different needs. It was then that Megan, the girl who had spoken up in the first session, suggested an idea that would change the group dynamic. "How about we create small groups within the workshop?" she proposed. This way, those who feel more comfortable sharing in smaller groups can do so, while others can continue in the main workshop. The idea was met with enthusiasm, and soon new groups emerged, each focusing on different aspects of writing. There was a group for poetry, another for short stories, and even one for chronicles and essays. Lucas stood in front of the main group, but encouraged all participants to explore different modalities and find their unique voices. The workshop, which was already a refuge for many, became even more inclusive and adaptable to the needs of each student. Lucas's leadership and the workshop's growth began to attract attention from outside the school. One day, the school district's principal, Mrs. Carmichael, visited Maplewood Middle School to see for herself what was going on. After talking to the students and seeing the positive results in their lives, she decided that the project should be expanded to other schools in the region. Lucas was invited to speak at a regional educator event where he shared his experience and the importance of giving. However, with success also came pressure. Lucas began to feel the weight of expectations, both from his peers and from teachers and administrators. He wondered if he would be able to continue balancing his own studies, his personal life, and responsibility for the workshop. One night, alone in his room, he found himself in front of the notebook of poems he had started before this whole journey. He realized that with everything that was going on, he had distanced himself from his own writing. This realization shook him deeply. Lucas realized that in his quest to keep Mr. Bennett's workshop and legacy alive, he had neglected himself. It was then that he made a difficult but necessary decision. He would need to find a way to continue the workshop without sacrificing his own passion for writing. Lucas called a special meeting of the workshop and, with a heavy heart, announced that he would hand over leadership responsibility to Megan, who had stood out as one of the strongest and most sensitive voices in the group. "I'll always be here to help," Lucas said. "But I realized I need to get back to my own words, my own stories. That's what the workshop is about after all, about finding our voices and never stopping using them." Megan accepted the responsibility with gratitude and determination, promising to keep the spirit of the workshop alive. Lucas felt a mix of relief and sadness, but also a renewed sense of purpose. He knew this was the next step in his journey. With more time for himself, Lucas returned to writing with fervor. His poems began to reflect the complexity of his recent experiences: the loss of Mr. Bennett, the pressure of leadership, personal growth. And over time, these words took on a new form. He began thinking about publishing his poems, not just as a book, but as a way to share his journey with other young people who might be going through the same difficulties. It was then that an unexpected opportunity arose. A state literary contest was being organized, and Megan, knowing Lucas's talent, encouraged him to participate. "You have a story to tell, Lucas," she said, "and the world needs to hear it." After much thought, Lucas decided to sign up. He submitted a collection of his poems titled "Voices from the Heart" in honor of the impact the workshop and Mr. Bennett had on his life. To his surprise, he was not only accepted into the contest, but also won first place. The victory was more than an award. It was confirmation that he was on the right path. But most importantly, it was the realization that his journey of overcoming and growing was still just beginning. Lucas had found his voice and was now ready to share it with the world. Lucas would never forget the day he received the news that he had won the state literary contest. When the email arrived, he was sitting on his bed, writing in his notebook, as he did every night. The sound of the notification made him stop. And when he opened the message, he felt a wave of emotions that left him stunned. Not only had his poems been recognized, but they were about to reach a much larger audience than he had ever imagined. The announcement of the victory was received with great enthusiasm at the school. His colleagues, who had previously despised or ignored him, now looked at him with a mixture of admiration and genuine respect. Even his teachers, who had always seen him as a reserved and introspective boy, were impressed by the impact he was making. The news quickly spread throughout Maplewood, and soon the entire town was celebrating Lucas's success. But the biggest surprise came when the competition organizers invited Lucas to read his poems at an award ceremony, which would take place at a renowned university in the state. It was a unique opportunity, but also an immense responsibility. Lucas knew this would be his chance to take his message beyond the walls of Maplewood, but the idea of performing in front of a large audience terrified him. The days leading up to the ceremony were full of preparation and nervousness. Lucas spent hours rehearsing his poems, trying to find the right tone for each word. He knew that the meaning of his words lay not just in how they were written, but in how they were said, and he wanted to make sure he did them justice. Megan and his other writing workshop friends supported him every step of the way, but no matter how much encouragement he received, the fear of failure was constant. When the day of the ceremony finally arrived, Lucas felt like he was about to climb a steep mountain, not knowing what he would find at the top. The auditorium was packed with hundreds of people, including renowned writers, teachers, and other young literary talents. Lucas couldn't believe he was there at the center of it all. He felt his heart beating faster, and his hands shook slightly as he held the notebook where his poems were written. When his name was called, Lucas slowly stood up and walked to the stage. The walk seemed endless, and each step echoed in his mind like a drumbeat. Upon reaching the microphone, he looked at the audience, trying to find a fixed point where he could focus his thoughts. It was then that, in the crowd, he saw a familiar face that brought him unexpected comfort. It was his mother, smiling with pride, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Beside her, to her surprise, was Brad, who had traveled there too. Their sight gave Lucas the strength he needed. He took a deep breath, opened his notebook, and began to read. The words flowed like a calm river, each one charged with emotion and truth. He read about his loneliness, about the pain of bullying, about the loss of Mr. Bennett, and about the strength he found in words. He read about the writing workshop and how it had become a beacon of hope in his life and the lives of others. And finally, you read about the importance of finding your own voice, and the entire room fell silent as he read, as if every person there was suspended in his words. When he finished, there was a moment's pause, followed by a wave of applause so powerful it seemed to make the auditorium shake. Lucas couldn't believe what was happening. He had done it. He had shared his story with the world, and the world had listened. After the ceremony, Lucas was surrounded by people who wanted to congratulate him, shake his hand, or simply tell him how much his words had touched them. Among these people were writers he admired, teachers who wanted to work with him, and young people who, like him, were looking for a way to express their own struggles and triumphs. Lucas realized that his words had real power, a power he had never imagined. But the biggest surprise came when one of the contest organizers approached him with an unexpected proposal. "Lucas," he said, "your story is powerful, and we believe it can inspire many other young people across the country. We would like to work with you to turn your collection of poems into a book, something that can reach an even wider audience. What do you think?" Lucas was speechless for a moment. A book? He had never imagined that something like this could happen so early in his life. The idea of his words reaching young people across the country, perhaps even across the world, was both exciting and frightening. But deep down, he knew it was the natural next step on his journey. He accepted the proposal with gratitude and determination. As he did so, Lucas felt a wave of emotion that he couldn't describe. He had started out as a shy, insecure boy who could barely talk about his feelings, and now he was on the verge of becoming a published author. His journey of self-discovery and overcoming was far from over, but he knew he was ready for whatever challenge came next. As Lucas left the auditorium that night, he looked up at the starry sky and felt a deep inner peace. He knew that no matter what happened from then on, he would always have his voice, his words, and the memory of Mr. Bennet to guide him. And most importantly, he knew that there would always be other voices waiting to be heard, and that he would do everything in his power to ensure that they were never silenced. The news that Lucas would publish a book spread quickly throughout Maplewood, causing a wave of excitement that swept not only the school, but the entire town. The boy who had started his journey facing loneliness and bullying was now a figure of inspiration to many, proving that words have the power to change lives. The publication of Voices from the Heart. It was an emotional process for Lucas, working with editors, reviewing her poems, and even writing an introduction that told her story in more detail were all a new adventure. During this time, he continued to participate in the writing workshop, now led by Megan, but with less frequent attendance as he was focused on his new responsibility as an author. Still, he made sure to be there whenever possible, knowing that this workshop was the root of every day. The day of the book's release was marked by a special ceremony at the city's library, a symbolic place where many of Maplewood's students, including Lucas, spent hours immersed in their reading. The library, decorated with balloons and posters advertising the event, was packed. Friends, family, teachers, and even people from the community that Lucas didn't know personally, but who had heard about his story, were there to celebrate this moment with him. Lucas, sitting at the autograph table, saw familiar and unfamiliar faces, all with copies of his book in their hands. He signed each one with a smile, exchanging words of thanks and encouragement with those who approached. For him, each signature was a reminder of how far he had come since those difficult early days. The biggest surprise of the day was when Brad showed up holding a copy of the book. "I had to have one of these," he said, handing the book to Lucas to sign. Lucas looked at Brad with a sincere smile. The transformation that had occurred between them was remarkable, and there at that moment they both knew that the journey they began as adversaries had led them to a friendship that neither of them expected. "Thanks for being here, Brad," Lucas said as he signed the book. "And thank you for everything. I wouldn't have gotten this far without the support of people like you." Brad smiled, a smile that carried more than words could express. "You deserve it, Lucas, you really deserve it." As the event continued, Lucas felt a calm settle within him. He was surrounded by people who believed in him, a community that supported him, and friends who, like him, had found their voices through words. He knew he was just beginning, that there was still a lot to be said, a lot to be written. But in that moment, he allowed himself to savor the realization of everything he had achieved. In the evening after the event, Lucas returned home and, for the first time in weeks, sat down to write not under the pressure of a deadline, but for the pure pleasure of getting his thoughts down on paper. He began a new poem, reflecting on everything he had learned and experienced over the past few months. The words flowed easily, each verse a tribute to the journey he had traveled. At the end of the poem, he wrote, "Words are seeds that we sow carefully. They grow in our hearts in an endless garden, and when shared, they blossom with meaning, touching souls that are lost like a whisper in the wind." When he finished, Lucas closed the notebook and looked at the moon shining outside. He knew that no matter what the future held, he would always have his words to guide him, to connect him with the world around him, and to remind him of who he was and where he came from. That night marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Lucas, the boy who once hid behind his words, now embraced them with pride, knowing that they were his strength, his purpose, and his connection to the world. And so, with a heart full of gratitude and hope, he fell asleep, knowing that the journey of self-discovery and overcoming never ends, but continues to unfold in every word we write and in every story we tell. A few years have passed since the release of Voices from the Heart. Maplewood had changed, and so had Lucas. He was now a young college student, studying literature at a prestigious college, something he would never have imagined in the dark days of his youth. Writing workshop has continued to thrive at Maplewood Middle School, with new students discovering the power of words each year. Megan, who had taken the lead with determination, kept Mr. Bennet's legacy alive by helping young people find more. Lucas, although busy with his studies, always found time to visit the school and participate in workshops. He had become an inspiring figure in the community, not only for his talent, but for his ability to connect with others in deep and meaningful ways. His book continued to touch lives, and he was working on new projects, including a second book, that explored the stories of other young people who, like him, had found strength in writing. One day, while strolling through the quiet streets of Maplewood, Lucas passed the park where he had so often sat with his notebook, writing in silence while the others played football. He smiled as he remembered who he was back then, the shy, lonely boy who found courage in words. When he arrived at the school, he found Megan leading a new workshop session. The room was full of young faces, some eager, others focused, all immersed in their creations. Megan smiled when she saw him and motioned for him to enter. "Welcome back, Lucas," she said. "We have a lot of new voices here today." Lucas nodded, feeling a surge of pride and satisfaction. He joined the group, listening to the readings, offering words of encouragement and advice. Each new poem, each new story the students read, was a testament to the lasting impact the writing workshop was having on the lives of these young people. At the end of the session, one of the younger students approached Lucas. "I read your book," said the boy shyly. "That's what inspired me to start writing. I just wanted to thank you." Lucas felt a surge of emotion, remembering how he had felt upon hearing similar words from Mr. Bennett. He smiled at the boy and replied, "Words have incredible power, and you have something important to share with the world. Never let anyone silence you." As Lucas left school that afternoon, he looked up at the sky, where the sun was beginning to set. He knew that the journey of self-discovery and overcoming was continuous, and that with each new challenge, with each new story, he would continue to grow. But more than that, he knew he had found his place in the world, a place where words were more than just symbols on a page. They were the essence of who he was and who he would always be.